we're going to have a really interesting episode here, Michael, because I have a bit of a dilemma going on. This is...
Enlighten me.
I mean, in life in general, but in terms of us sitting here, this is the Stackin Sats podcast, and I am, someone who works in the Bitcoin mining industry. I'm someone who navigates as generally a Bitcoin maxi. And, this is a big undertaking, is running the show and having the right people on to talk about Bitcoin, etc. But the thing with Bitcoin is it touches so many aspects of just how life works in general that I really don't like and appreciate the closed-minded idea that it's only about Bitcoin, that everything else doesn't matter. Because if we're talking about just currency, yes, I think currency-wise, Bitcoin, the digital gold standard, is what I support and the way we need to go. But in terms of understanding the future of the technology and the innovation that's coming, it's not just Bitcoin. Bitcoin is one piece of this. And as I'm exploring how to do the podcast best, besides being my number one critic, I want to make sure that everyone who I'm addressing in the audience really gets to see who I am and what it is I want to do. So while I have this dilemma, I think the only answer to it is to put my head down, to speak with everyone who I think is interesting, who has really interesting concepts to bring to the table. And that's not going to necessarily be Bitcoin 24/7. So I just want to let you know the dilemma, because it is something that has been racing in my head, kind of getting ready for this episode.
I think it's not invalid whatsoever, that sort of thought process. It's actually taking on a very multidisciplinary approach, I would say, is how do you can't take any component in isolation and expect to be able to critique it that way. Everything exists in context of, something else, right? And it actually goes back to like the interdisciplinary research that I was doing is, I had to take context of, okay, what does blockchain do? But what could it do theoretically in the context of business, in the context of art, in the context of science, or, any other application? So I would call it a very good dilemma to have to understand, is like, how can we broaden the applications of a technology, an infrastructure, and have it apply to many things? Because that's how you 100x an audience, is how can you make it apply to everyone in some way, shape, or form, and have it be as ubiquitous as if you ask someone, hey, did you go on Robinhood and buy crypto? Not sponsored. I don't recommend that, by the way. Probably if you ask any average American that, you'll probably have a very a small percentage of them that say, yes, I did, versus the overwhelmingly ubiquitous amount of people that say, have you used the internet today? Everyone will say probably yes. So it really is an argument for I'd say it really is an argument for how do you position blockchain, or how do you position all the current technologies that are being used today relative to blockchain as like absolutely necessary for your average person.
100%. And I think, when we spoke over the phone briefly, you are one of the people who I want to navigate through that conversation with. From my perspective, the big skepticism for Bitcoin maxis and people who support, Bitcoin in general, is that when people talk about decentralization and they talk about blockchain, a lot of these cryptocurrencies, doing so, altcoins, are more or less bringing a marketing kind of structure to it, and they're not being honest and truthful with the audience. And I think that's something that together we can really bridge the gap to explain that there is nuance to the idea of what can blockchain infrastructure do, for example, or how is AR and VR going to coincide with a future of a digital financial system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, one of the first things I ever bring up in any conversation with anyone that's either new to crypto or trying to figure it out, is it a good thing to get into? Is it a bad thing to get into? I try to divorce the idea of currency and the volatility that may come with financial markets and risk, et cetera, and the actual infrastructure. Because when you have an internet-enabled currency, you are taking the summation of every global finance risk that you can, like, for example, if you were to, let's use a traditional finance example. If you were trying to calculate the volatility of the Australian dollar to the British pound, that already has some intrinsic volatility that you're going to be dealing with, right? Mm. Take that summation for every single currency that exists in every country, and you have like the volatility of like what cryptocurrency is seeing, because it's available and accessible to everyone over the internet. It's a very large paradigm shift that if you have an internet connection, you can participate in a global economy with global volatility, which does turn a lot of people off, because now suddenly that volatility has not all the information has been factored in yet, because people are still adjusting to like what magic internet money, quote unquote, actually means, right? Yeah. But then we look at the other side and say, currency is just one factor. It's just one, it's a large one. It's what people know blockchain to be used for, but it's not the only factor. And I think that's the really important part, is when you're talking about no central entity controlling a flow of information, I think that becomes really powerful. Especially one of the most powerful things that have been applied is the currency part. But when you're talking about things like everything from self-custody data to what I'm doing right now, digital rights management, how do you, for example, how do you truly own assets? How do you truly have provenance of something? How do you, how can you prove that you probably owned something? Medical records that can now transcend borders. Information that is no longer, you no longer have to worry about companies storing your third-party data. You bring your own authentication. You bring your own data in that sense. I think what the blockchain is an exercise in self-trust, is that we don't have to trust anyone. It's a trustless system inherently, and the only people that we should be able to fundamentally trust in that sense should first and foremost be ourselves, and then we can assign additional trust wherever else we need it. It's also solving the principal agent problem, which is, can you really trust someone to act in your own best interest? Can you trust someone else to act in your own best interest? In finance, you have financial advisors that act as fiduciaries. This is the reason why they need to act in your own best interest, because you signed an agreement with them. Not every company in the world, not every organization you work with has a fiduciary duty to you that is expressly outlined for that purpose. So the blockchain really does serve to bring back that notion of you are your own, you are your own source of custody in that sense. So whether it's your data, whether it's your privacy, whether it's in the case that I'm working with, whether it's your content, if you're working in the medical field, if it's your records. And for example, if I wanted to go to Europe and I started working with a doctor there's already a lot of friction, inside a medical system in America. But imagine transferring everything over to a healthcare system in another region. And now you have additional layers of complexity that shouldn't fundamentally be there, but could be solved with a universal single source of truth. And I think that's the thing, is you can, anything that needs a universal single source of truth is where that infrastructure really comes into play. So that's the way that, to sum it all up, is the way that I like to divorce those two.
I think it's fantastic, the divorce idea. I think it's a good way to get the idea out of people's heads that this is something to make you rich. This is something to give you, infinite resources, and really just talk about the concepts, the ideas of people like you whose brains are spinning when they're thinking about all this.